My boyfriend copied my master's thesis and tried to present it as his own. The only thing he gained was humiliation. I spent 3 years working on my master's thesis in environmental engineering, while my boyfriend Colin breezed through his business degree barely attending classes. We met in undergrad, and he'd always joked that dating me was like having a private tutor since I'd explain concepts from his courses that he didn't understand. I thought it was cute that he valued my intelligence. I should have seen the signs when he started calling my research little projects and saying my degree was just fancy recycling studies while his degree would make real money. Colin moved in with me during my final year when I was deep into writing my thesis on microplastic filtration systems. He'd complain constantly that I spent more time with my laptop than with him. He'd slam doors when I worked late, order food and eat it in front of me without getting me any, and tell his friends I was ignoring him for schoolwork like it was some kind of betrayal. But he sure got interested when I started getting recognition for my research. My advisor, Dr. Castellano, had submitted my preliminary findings to a conference, and they'd won Best Emerging Research. Suddenly, Colin wanted to know everything about my thesis. He'd sit next to me while I worked, asking questions, saying he was just being supportive. He asked for copies of my drafts to read so he could understand what I was doing. I sent him my files thinking it was sweet he finally cared about my work. 2 weeks before my defense, Colin's attitude completely changed. He was cheerful, bringing me coffee, telling me not to stress so much about the defense because these things always worked out. He even suggested I take a break and visit my parents for a few days before the big presentation. I said I couldn't leave with so much to prepare, but he kept insisting I was overthinking everything. The night before my defense, my laptop crashed. Complete blue screen, wouldn't turn back on. Colin immediately offered to take it to his friend who fixed computers. I was panicking, but Colin said not to worry. My thesis was backed up on the cloud anyway. I could access it from any computer tomorrow. I spent all night at the library printing copies from my cloud drive, practicing my presentation. The next morning, I walked into my defense room to find Colin sitting at the presentation table, with my advisor, and the entire review committee. Dr. Castellano looked confused and asked why I was there. I said I was here for my thesis defense. Colin laughed and said I must be confused. This was his defense. He'd transferred to our engineering program 6 months ago without telling me, taking night classes to meet the requirements. He pulled out a bound copy of my thesis with his name on the cover. He told the committee I'd been helping him with some research, but I'd gotten confused about whose project it was. He actually said I'd been under a lot of stress lately and might be having a breakdown. Dr. Castellano asked to see my version. I handed her my printed copy. It was identical to Colin's except for the name on the cover. Colin said I'd obviously copied his work since we lived together. He said he felt terrible, but he'd been suspicious when I suddenly had a thesis ready, right when his was due. The committee asked when I'd started this research. I said 3 years ago. Colin said that was impossible since the research was based on his original ideas from his business background. Dr. Castellano pulled up her computer and showed the conference submission from 8 months ago with my name on it. Colin said he'd let me present his preliminary work to help build my confidence. He'd practiced this story. But what Colin didn't know was that our university had implemented new plagiarism software that tracked digital fingerprints. Every time you save a document, it creates a hidden timestamp with the user information from the computer. Dr. Castellano ran both documents through the system right there in the room. The results showed my document had been created and edited continuously for 3 years on my laptop, with thousands of saves, each one traced to my student login. Colin's document had been created 2 weeks ago, with only 3 saves, all on his laptop, all copying and pasting from my original files. The metadata showed he'd literally just changed the name fields. The committee asked Colin to explain any part of the research. He started talking about water filtration in general terms, nothing specific to my thesis. When they asked about the mathematical models I'd developed, he said those were standard formulas anyone could find. Dr. Castellano asked him to write one of the formulas on the board. He couldn't. She asked him to explain the testing methodology. He said it was all in the paper. She asked what equipment he'd used. He didn't know the names of any of it. Then the committee chair asked me the same questions. I walked to the board and wrote out the differential equation that described particle capture efficiency in my filtration system. The chalk felt solid in my hand as I explained how I'd derived it from first principles, combining Stokes' law with Brownian motion calculations. I talked about the prototype iterations, how the first design clogged within hours because I'd miscalculated the pore size distribution. The second one worked better, but the pressure drop was too high for practical applications. The third design failed when I tried to scale it up, the flow patterns breaking down at larger volumes. I explained the breakthrough that led to the final design, how I'd realized the polymer matrix needed a gradient structure instead of uniform porosity. Dr. Castellano nodded as I described our weekly meetings where we'd troubleshoot each problem, her notes from those sessions matching every detail I recounted. I listed the equipment in the lab, the spectrophotometer settings I'd used for particle analysis, the specific brands of polymers I'd tested. Colin had sat in that lab exactly twice, both times complaining about the chemical smell and asking when we could leave. The committee dismissed Colin from the room. He stood slowly, his face blank, and walked out without looking at me. The door clicked shut and Liliana Whitehead leaned forward across the table. She told me they were unanimous. My defense was exemplary, she said, and the evidence of plagiarism was completely clear. They were failing Colin's submission immediately and recommending expulsion proceedings to the dean. I felt something release in my chest, like I'd been holding my breath for weeks. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, though, adrenaline still flooding my system from the confrontation. Dr. Castellano squeezed my shoulder and said we'd schedule my actual defense for next week, that this disaster didn't change the quality of my work. The other committee members gathered their papers and filed out, a few of them stopping to tell me they were sorry I'd had to experience this. I sat in the empty room for several minutes after they left, staring at the equation I'd written on the board, trying to process that it was over. Colin was waiting in the hallway when I came out. He started toward me with his hands up, his voice taking on that reasonable tone he used when he wanted something. He said we could have worked this out privately, that involving the committee was an overreaction. I stopped walking and looked at him. I told him he stole 3 years of my work and tried to destroy my career, that there was nothing left to discuss between us. His expression changed, the fake concern dropping away like a mask. His eyes went cold and his mouth tightened into a thin line. He said I'd regret making this public, that I had no idea who I was messing with. I walked past him toward the exit, my legs feeling unsteady but my decision absolutely clear. He called after me but I didn't turn around. I spent the next 2 days moving my stuff out of our apartment while Colin was in meetings with university administration. My friend helped me load boxes into her car, working quickly to get everything out before he came back. I was pulling clothes from the closet we'd shared when I found printed copies of my thesis hidden behind his winter coats. The pages were dated 6 months ago, covered in his handwriting, marking sections and making notes. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't a 2-week plan. He'd been preparing to steal my work for half a year, reading my drafts and planning his story while he kissed me goodnight and told me he was proud of me. I sat on the floor holding those papers, feeling the betrayal cut deeper than it had in the defense room. He'd been methodically preparing to destroy me while pretending to love me, every supportive comment and coffee delivery part of a long con to position himself to take credit for my research. Dr. Castellano called me that evening at my friend's apartment where I was staying temporarily. The university was launching a full investigation into Colin's academic history, she said, because his transfer to engineering was raising red flags. The registrar had discovered he'd actually failed out of his business program, that his family had made a large donation to get him special admission to engineering, despite not meeting any of the prerequisites. I felt relieved that the investigation was expanding beyond just my case, but exhausted at the thought of reliving everything through official testimony and documentation. Dr. Castellano said she'd be with me through the whole process, that the department was taking this seriously. I thanked her and hung up, then lay on my friend's couch staring at the ceiling, too wired to sleep. My phone started blowing up the next day with messages from mutual friends. Most of them had heard something happened and were asking for details, but their messages felt wrong. They wanted Colin's side of the story, like there were 2 valid perspectives here. 3 people suggested I was overreacting, that couples share work all the time and maybe this was just a misunderstanding. One friend sent a long message about how Colin was really struggling right now, and maybe I felt crazy reading these messages. Like I was living in an alternate reality where stealing someone's thesis was a reasonable relationship disagreement. I realized Colin had been talking to people, spinning a narrative that framed this as a communication problem instead of deliberate theft. The isolation hit me hard, the sense that even people I'd considered friends were willing to minimize what he'd done, because believing the worst about him was uncomfortable. The IT specialist analyzing Colin's laptop contacted me through Dr. Castellano a week later. They'd found emails between Colin and another student named Sabina Thompson from 2 years ago. The emails contained her original research, and it matched a paper Colin had submitted in his business program word for word. I felt sick reading Dr. Castellano's summary of the findings. I wasn't his first victim, just the one who finally had enough evidence and institutional support to expose him. The university was reaching out to Sabina to inform her about the discovery and ask if she wanted to pursue action. I wondered how many other people he'd done this to, how many times he'd gotten away with it before the plagiarism software caught him. Sabina called me 3 days later. We met at a coffee shop off campus, both of us nervous about the conversation. She was older than me, already working in marketing, and she looked tired when she sat down across from me. She told me her story in a quiet voice, how Colin had dated her during his business degree and seemed supportive of her work. He'd copied her entire marketing research thesis and submitted it as his own capstone project after they broke up. She'd reported it but couldn't prove it because she hadn't kept detailed documentation like I had. Colin's family hired lawyers who sent her threatening letters about defamation, and she'd eventually dropped the complaint because she couldn't afford legal help, and the stress was destroying her. She warned me that his parents would come after me hard, that they'd protected him from consequences his entire life and wouldn't stop now. I felt angry for her and scared for myself, realizing this was going to get worse before it got better. Colin's mother showed up at my temporary housing 2 days later. She knocked on the door, and when I opened it, she pushed past me into the apartment without asking. She demanded I talk to her about ruining her son's future over a misunderstanding. Her voice was sharp and entitled, like I was being unreasonable by not letting Colin steal my work. She offered me money, pulling out her checkbook and asking how much it would take for me to reconsider my testimony. She said that as Colin's girlfriend, I should want to help him rather than destroy him, that couples support each other through difficulties. I grabbed my phone and started recording the conversation, my hands shaking as I held it. She noticed and her expression hardened, but she kept talking, saying I was being vindictive and cruel. When she finally left, I immediately sent the recording to Victor Schwartz in the university legal office, feeling shaken by how aggressively she'd tried to buy my silence. I tried to work on my research the next week, to move forward with the actual defense that was scheduled. But when I opened my laptop and pulled up my thesis document, my chest tightened and I couldn't breathe. My heart started racing and my hands went numb, a full panic attack hitting me in the middle of the library. I had to leave and sit outside, focusing on breathing until the feeling passed. Simple tasks like opening that file triggered these spirals where I questioned whether any of my ideas were actually original, or if Colin had poisoned my entire academic identity by stealing my work. I couldn't sleep more than a few hours a night, lying awake replaying the defense room scene and his mother's visit. I'd lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks because eating felt impossible when my stomach was constantly churning with anxiety. My friend noticed and made me promise to call campus counseling, but I kept putting it off, telling myself I just needed to get through the defense first. Victor called me 3 days later with news from his investigation. He'd been digging through university records and found something that made my stomach drop. Colin's family had donated a new computer lab to the business school worth over $500,000. The donation happened the exact same semester Colin got readmitted after failing out of his business program. Victor explained that the timing was suspicious, and the university administration was now reviewing whether Colin's special admission had been part of a deal that let him skip normal academic standards. I felt my hands start shaking as I realized that money had bought Colin access to everything. The wealth his family had didn't just protect him after he did something wrong, it gave him chances he never earned in the first place. Other students had to meet requirements and prove they deserved to be there, but Colin just needed his parents to write a check. That same corruption let him get close to me, to Sabina, to whoever else he'd hurt. The anger felt different from before, heavier and colder, because it wasn't just about what he'd done to me personally anymore. The next morning, I opened my email and saw a message from someone named Silas Guthrie. He was the conference organizer who'd given my preliminary research the Emerging Research Award 8 months ago. My chest tightened as I read the first line asking if we could discuss some concerns that had come up. He wrote that several attendees were questioning whether my research was actually legitimate, given the recent plagiarism scandal at my university. Someone had been spreading rumors at academic events saying maybe Colin had done the real work, and I was the one who stole it. They were weaponizing what happened to destroy my professional reputation before I even graduated. I felt sick reading his polite, careful language asking for clarification. Everything I'd worked for was twisted and used against me. My research that I'd spent 3 years developing was suddenly suspect because Colin had tried to steal it. I forwarded the email to Dr. Castellano and then sat staring at my laptop screen, too scared to do anything else. Dr. Castellano called me within an hour and her voice was tight with anger. She told me she was already drafting a response to Silas with comprehensive documentation proving the timeline of my work. She sounded more furious than I'd ever heard her, talking fast about how she'd include my lab notebooks, our email correspondence from the past 3 years, meeting notes from our progress sessions and the original conference submission materials. She said she'd provide detailed testimony about my independent work that started long before I even met Colin. I could hear her typing while we talked, already pulling together evidence. She promised me she would shut down these rumors directly and make sure everyone understood the truth. I thanked her, but after we hung up, I just felt empty and tired. Even with her fighting for me, even with all the evidence on my side, I knew some people would always wonder. The damage felt permanent even though my mentor was going to battle to protect my reputation. Victor contacted me again 4 days later saying Colin's lawyer wanted to talk. The lawyer had sent a settlement offer through the university legal office. Colin would accept expulsion and drop any appeals if I signed a non-disclosure agreement and promised not to speak publicly about what happened. They were offering $15,000 for my trouble and emotional distress. I stared at the number in Victor's email. $15,000 would pay off my student loans from this semester and cover my rent for months while I looked for a job. The money would solve immediate problems that were keeping me up at night. I could sign the paper, take the check, and try to move on with my life. But the NDA meant I couldn't warn other students about Colin. I couldn't help Sabina if she wanted to pursue her own case. I couldn't speak up if someone else came forward later. The lawyer's letter made it clear that taking the money meant staying quiet about everything forever. I scheduled an appointment with campus legal aid the next day because I needed to understand what I was actually choosing. The attorney was a woman in her 40s who listened to the whole story and then pulled out the settlement offer to review it. She explained that NDAS in academic fraud cases were ethically questionable at best. My testimony could be important for systemic change at the university and for protecting future students from people like Colin. She walked me through what accepting the money would mean, how it would prioritize my short-term relief over long-term accountability. But she also acknowledged that I'd been through something really hard, and nobody could blame me for wanting it to be over. She said the choice was mine to make based on what I could emotionally handle, and there wasn't a right or wrong answer. I left her office feeling more confused than when I went in, carrying the weight of deciding between my own peace and speaking up for people I didn't even know yet. The university expelled Colin 2 weeks later after their investigation wrapped up. Victor sent me a copy of their findings, which confirmed everything: plagiarism, fraudulent admission, and attempted witness intimidation through his mother's visit to my apartment. But when the university released their public statement, it was vague and careful. They didn't name Colin or acknowledge that he'd targeted multiple victims over several years. The statement talked about upholding academic integrity standards and taking appropriate action, but it read like they were protecting their own reputation more than being transparent. I should have felt relieved or victorious, but instead I just felt hollow. The institution had done the minimum required to address what happened while making sure nothing looked too bad for them. Colin was gone, but the system that enabled him was still there, still careful about its image, still unwilling to admit how someone like him had operated within it for so long. I told Victor my decision 3 days after the expulsion. I was rejecting the NDA and the settlement money because I wanted the freedom to speak about what happened if it could help other students. He said he'd communicate that to Colin's lawyer and warned me they might not react well. The response came back within hours. Colin's lawyer sent a letter threatening defamation lawsuits if I made any false statements publicly. The threats were empty because I knew truth was an absolute defense against defamation, but seeing the words on paper still made my hands shake. I was choosing ongoing vulnerability and potential retaliation over the safety of silence. Part of me wanted to take it back, to call Victor and say I'd changed my mind about the money, but I couldn't make myself do it because accepting would mean letting Colin and his family win in a different way. I found an academic integrity platform online where students could share experiences with plagiarism and institutional responses. The site verified users through their university emails and let people post detailed accounts with documentation. I spent 2 days writing everything out: the 3-year timeline of my research, the defense room confrontation, Colin's pattern of behavior with other victims, the university's investigation process, and how his family tried to buy my silence. I used my real name and uploaded copies of the metadata analysis, the conference submission, and Victor's investigation summary. Posting it felt like standing on the edge of something high and deciding to jump. I was scared of the consequences, but also felt something like relief, like I was finally taking back control of my own story after weeks of Colin and his family writing the narrative for me. The post started getting attention within days. My inbox filled with messages from other students, mostly women, who'd experienced similar things. 7 people across 3 different universities reached out to share stories about romantic partners or close friends who'd plagiarized their work. 2 of them said they were thinking about coming forward with their own cases after reading what I wrote. One message came from a graduate student who said her ex-boyfriend had stolen her dissertation proposal, and she'd dropped out rather than fight it because she didn't think anyone would believe her. Reading their stories made me feel less alone, but also overwhelmed by how common this apparently was. Academic theft through intimate relationships wasn't some rare thing that happened to me because I was unlucky. It was a pattern that nobody talked about publicly because victims were too scared or ashamed to speak up. Silas sent me a direct email 2 weeks after my post went up. The conference was featuring my research as a highlighted presentation at their next event in 6 months. They were offering full travel funding plus an emerging researcher award with a cash prize. He apologized for not shutting down the rumors more aggressively when they first started and said he wanted to make a clear public statement about my legitimate contributions to the field. Reading his email made me feel proud, but also completely exhausted. I'd had to fight twice as hard as anyone else to receive recognition I already earned. My work was good enough to win awards and get featured presentations, but first I had to survive someone trying to steal it, and then defend my own legitimacy against rumors. The validation felt good, but it also felt like it came at too high a cost. I made my first appointment with the campus counseling center 3 days after the conference news came through. The receptionist gave me paperwork asking what I wanted help with, and I wrote, relationship betrayal and academic fraud, because those seemed like the simplest words for what happened. Cordelia McKinney had gray hair pulled back in a loose bun and an office filled with plants that made the space feel less clinical. She asked me to describe what brought me in, and I started crying before I finished the first sentence about Colin stealing my thesis. The crying surprised me because I thought I was past that part, but apparently my body disagreed. Cordelia handed me tissues and waited while I pulled myself together enough to explain the whole timeline. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes, and when I finished, she said something that caught me off guard. She told me I kept using phrases like, I should have known, and I missed all the signs, like Colin's manipulation was something I failed to prevent. She asked if I'd blame a friend for getting robbed just because they didn't notice someone following them home. I said no, that would be cruel. She asked why I was being crueler to myself than I'd ever be to someone I cared about. That first session left me feeling raw and exhausted, but also like someone finally understood that this wasn't just about plagiarism or a bad breakup. The next few months of therapy involved picking apart every interaction with Colin, learning to separate his deliberate manipulation from my legitimate trust in someone I loved. Cordelia helped me see patterns I'd normalized, like how he'd undermine my work while benefiting from my intelligence, or how he'd create chaos right before important deadlines. She gave me tools for recognizing when I was blaming myself for not being psychic enough to detect his planning. The work was painful and slow, but necessary if I wanted to trust my own judgment again, instead of second-guessing every professional relationship. 4 months after my defense, Dr. Castellano forwarded me an email from the dean's office. The university was implementing new plagiarism detection policies, requiring metadata analysis for all thesis submissions starting next semester. Every graduate student would have their work automatically scanned for digital fingerprints and timestamp verification before their defense could be scheduled. The policy memo cited recent cases of academic fraud, without naming me or Colin specifically, but I knew my situation had forced their hand. Dr. Castellano called me that afternoon to explain the engineering department was going further. They were developing protocols for documenting student research from day one, requiring regular progress reports with dated evidence and mandatory backup systems that tracked every stage of development. Committee members would receive training in digital forensics, so they could spot manipulation attempts before students reached the defense stage. She told me the department head had referenced my case in a faculty meeting, praising how I'd handled the situation and using it as a teaching moment about protecting student work. The changes felt meaningful even though they came too late to help me or Sabina. I wanted to feel purely good about the new policies, but part of me was angry that it took my trauma to make the institution care about prevention. Still, knowing future students might be protected from what I experienced gave me some sense that the nightmare served a purpose beyond destroying my trust in relationships. I accepted the job offer from the environmental consulting firm 6 weeks after the university announced their policy changes. The hiring manager told me they'd been following my microplastic filtration research since the conference presentation, and were impressed by both my technical skills and how I'd handled the plagiarism situation. She said integrity under pressure showed character they valued in their team, and my willingness to fight for my work, rather than accept a settlement, demonstrated the kind of backbone they needed. Starting the position felt like stepping into a future I'd earned through legitimate credentials and expertise, rather than luck or connections. My first project involved analyzing water samples from industrial sites, applying the filtration methods I'd developed in my thesis to real-world contamination problems. Walking into the lab on my first day, surrounded by equipment I knew how to use and colleagues who respected my knowledge, I felt something shift inside me. This was mine in a way Colin could never touch or steal. But I also knew the betrayal wasn't something I'd just get over with a new job and some therapy sessions. Trusting people would be harder now, especially in professional settings where my work was valuable. I'd probably spend years processing what he did and rebuilding the confidence he shattered when he tried to erase my name from 3 years of research. The job was a step forward, but healing would take much longer than 4 months.